Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Hazlett. I'm the Executive Director for CCAE and thrilled to be online again this Wednesday afternoon for the fifth of our COVID-19 webinar series presentations. This year, we're diving into the area of communications, changing the narrative, how schools and organizations have changed from writing and putting things out with respect to campaigns, alumni events, on-campus activities, student celebrations, into a little bit more of a pandemic messaging piece. We're very pleased today to have four members of our panel with us. Derek Cassoff from McGill, Grant Hamilton from Brandon University, Katie Kostiuk from The Study, independent school in Montreal, and Rob Moore, VP of Communications with CASE, is joining us as well. This webinar is presented using the Zoom webinar tool. Participants can certainly hear us and see us, but you have no audio or video back to us. That allows us to flow through a conversation and a panel discussion over the next hour. We have a number of submitted questions and some topics we're going to talk to. This event is being recorded, and CCA will share that out with all the registered participants in the next week, and will also be posted on our website. This, as I mentioned, is the fifth in our series. We've got four more to go after this. We wrap up late in May with a return of our original first 8 panel members that we brought together on March 25th, just to sort of catch up and hear what they've been doing in the last 8 weeks since this all started. And so it's been about 4 or 5 weeks, middle of March, when things really sort of started to take off. We had a little conversation last week. A group of us on February 27th, the CCA board met in Toronto, and nowhere in any notes from that meeting are the words coronavirus or COVID-19. And yet 2 weeks after that is when we started to see campus closures and changes across the country. And in terms of communications, a lot of things had to change, and a lot of things had to change very quickly across schools and across the country. And that's what this conversation is going to focus on today. I'm going to start by asking each member of the panel to give us a little bit of an overview of what happened in those early days, how your communications may have changed. What you might also do as you start is just let people know about the structure of communications at your institution, or in your case, Rob, what you're experiencing from the CASE perspective, just so folks can understand advancement, alumni communications versus institutional, bigger communications. And so, Grant, I'm going to start with you and your perspective from at Brandon University.
Thanks a lot, Mark. So I'm Grant. I'm from Brandon University, where I'm Director of Marketing and Communications. I really appreciate being here today, and I appreciate being the first speaker, so I can say the obvious things and everybody else can nod along and say, yes, I agree with Grant. That was excellent. Great points. Brandon University is a fairly small institution. Obviously, we don't have a large team. We don't have a lot of extra capacity. Until recently, marketing and communications, alumni, and advancement were all lumped together under an external relations umbrella. We've recently, relatively recently, split those into 2 separate units, but we continue to work really, really closely together. It's the same team. Our offices are close together, and there isn't necessarily a dedicated people in advancement, in alumni, for communication. So all of that, like all other marketing and communications, rests with the marketing and communications team at BU. So that means all our communications are aligned, just naturally, right? It all comes through the same funnel, but it also means it's a lot of work to make sure that you hit each unique audience in its unique way. And that was, as everybody I'm sure experienced and everybody knows, just a challenge during the pandemic. I mean, the things we were doing on Wednesday were inconceivable on Monday. And then the things we had to do by Friday were 2 new steps beyond what we thought we would have to do on Wednesday. So the sheer volume of information that was coming and the information that was changing was a tremendous challenge. And what we really had to do was ramp down our communications in some ways so that we could be really focused on the audiences that mattered most. And to us, that was largely internal audiences. So we were really focused on getting the messages out to faculty and students and people who suddenly couldn't come on campus locally, rather than doing as much communication as maybe we would have liked to do to donors and alumni. So a tremendous change there in the early days that I think has necessitated a revisiting of where we rebalance those priorities now that things have calmed down a little bit and we look to be reopening in the nearer future. So that's maybe an overview of what it's like at BU and what it was like, but I'm sure everybody has similar tales from those crazy days.
Thanks, Grant. That's a great introduction. I think the ramping down is an interesting sort of piece of terminology. I think common thought would be that everybody had to ramp up in order to deal with the communications and how you get that out and changing audiences. So interesting to hear you use that language. I'm going to flip over to Derek at McGill to give us a bit of a background on that design and what they went through in the early days. Derek?
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for the invitation to be here. So yeah, basically everything Grant said, exactly. No, no, and as a matter of fact, so I'm the managing director of communications in the advancement communication shop at McGill. We're quite a different setup from what Grant described at Brandon. We're obviously a much larger unit. I manage a team of about 25 people, and we're focused exclusively on communications to alumni and donors. Where that was important in the aftermath of the beginning days of the pandemic was that we didn't have to worry about the kind of operational communication. So we have a very large central communications and media relations team at McGill. They were really the ones focused on getting critical crisis communications out to faculty, to staff, to students, dealing with the media that was sort of at our doorstep virtually. That allowed us to focus all of our attention really on how we were going to pivot our communications to alumni and donors. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk a little more detail about some of what we did, but I would just say that the first 48 hours were an incredible time for us. We literally went from being a sort of all-purpose communication shop, communicating messages about a whole bunch of different ideas. We launched a campaign a few months earlier, so there was all this kind of donor communications, and we just made a quick 180 and became sort of all COVID-19 all the time. We launched what was going to be a one-time, but that became a sort of weekly alumni webcast featuring some of the expertise from McGill on not just the science, but various aspects of the pandemic. We completely sort of threw in the garbage, essentially, our next email. We have sort of an email that was supposed to go out in a couple of days. It was, your typical wonderful profiles of alumni, people doing great things in the world. We essentially put that aside and built within a few days a whole new communications platform to get regular information out to our alumni and donors. And if you were to come to any of our websites now, either the alumni website or our campaign website, or review any of our email communications, you would think that all we've ever done in our life is COVID-19, because it's basically how is the university responding to COVID-19. And we could talk a little bit more perhaps later on about why that was so important for us. But maybe I'll just sort of end my concluding remarks here, or introductory remarks, I should say.
Thank you, Derek. That's a good overview, and interesting, again, the separation at McGill. Size, I think, certainly plays into that, where you've got a central comms really dealing with the institutional messaging, which could be another whole webinar all on its own, I'm sure. Katie's at a small school. She's the director of advancement at the study, and so kind of wears a lot of different hats. And we're interested to hear, Katie, at your school, how things sort of started and how you managed to change the narrative a little bit.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you, Mark. It's really interesting to hear what Grant and what Derek have been saying. At the study, we are a small shop. We have a designated marketing and communications team that supports our advancement team and that also supports our admissions team. We do work very, very, very closely together. And certainly in the context of advancement communications from the get-go, you know, we're really lucky because we had a very, very simple message from the get-go that really hasn't changed a lot. You know, our campus may be closed and our facilities may be closed, but our learning still continues. And that really has permeated. The simplicity of the messaging has really sort of permeated all of our communications in one way or another. As Grant was saying, I thought that was really interesting. We had at one point deliberately sort of brought down all of our, or diminished our deliberate communications with our donors and our alum in light of everything else that was going on. We were focusing on our internal community and our immediate communities, our staff, our faculty, and certainly our students and our families. But we felt as a school, and something we've always done, we felt that one of the things that we rely on is really our connections, our connectivity, and our authenticity with our donors. And so keeping that alive in very, very sort of organic ways, a phone call, an email, a text message, those were the communication modalities of choice with our donors and our old girls, we call them old girls, and our old girls in early days. So, so really, our MO has really been to remain connected in those ways.
Super, thanks, Katie. I like the learning still continues piece. I think that's a good message to keep pushing out there. So Rob is with us from CASE, obviously not one specific school, but we asked Rob to join us just to give us some insight about how CASE has supported its members. And I see he's changed his name from Rob Moore to case.org/COVID resources. So obviously directing folks a place to go to get some information. Rob, what have you heard, experienced, been involved with when this whole thing started about a month and a bit ago?
Thank you, Mark. Well, actually, for us, it started before that. As you know, we have about 3,600 member institutions around the world, 82 countries. And so we first got inklings of this when it would have been in early February. When it appeared to be, you know, an issue. It was before it was changed to a pandemic, when it was an epidemic primarily in China. We had a conference upcoming. It's supposed to actually be last week in Singapore, and Singapore was an early site of kind of the eruption of the contagion, and Singapore basically shut down. So we had to, as early as I think February 15th or so, we had to cancel our conference, Asia Pacific Advancement Conference in Singapore, because all the signs were saying that it wasn't going to be able to be held. And so we started to see this sort of rolling concern at different countries where we work. And that really exploded, as you said, Mark, or perhaps as Grant said, in early March. We were actually having a CASE board meeting that ended on March 12th, I think. And at that point, everything was shut down. We closed our offices we had closed the offices in Singapore already. We closed the offices in DC and in London and in Mexico City. And we were really at that point dealing with a fire hose of information, how to support our members as they were dealing with things like campus closures and student safety. And what do you do with students who can't go home because the students are actually international students and international travel has been forbidden? I mean, there are all those kinds of emergency response things that we were working on. And one of the things we did, I changed my name, as Mark pointed out, to case.org COVID resources. We mounted a page on our website. This is in front of the paywall, so you don't have to be a CASE member to get to it. But you can go there and see what other folks are doing, other whether it's reports from World Health Organization or whatever else about what's going on, about how we can respond. What we've seen recently is that, and I'll go back to Grant's ramp down, we had to really ramp up dramatically in the first 3 to 4 weeks. It was crazy. We're trying to get everything out there. We were canceling conferences left and right and dealing with the cancellation or the moving of conferences from an in-person to an online format. So that was all pretty crazy in the first month. What we've seen recently is things have slowed down a lot. And in fact, we're kind of trying to back out. We've been very active in pushing information into our members, into their mailboxes, into other things like that. And we're backing down. We're seeing that most folks are kind of saying, I've survived the initial emergency, the initial crisis. And now we're really thinking forward to things like what happens with the beginning of next semester. Are we going to be able to open? Are we going to be able to have our residence halls filled? You know, if our residence halls are counting on 2 and 3 people in a room, well, you can't do social distancing with 3 people in a room. So, you know, so it's really a planning forward process is going on now. So we're trying to be, again, being a resource or repository of ideas that people can use as they go forward.
Thanks, Rob. That's great. There's no doubt the case resources are excellent, and I think the big note, we certainly went through them. We looked at them as we kept preparing ourselves for what we were doing, and I think kudos to putting them in front of the paywall, because I think that has helped a lot of schools. I want to just ask a question and a show of hands to everybody on the panel first. Did your school have a crisis communications plan in place? Yeah, so I think today's, and I've been around the advancement space now almost 30 years. I think everybody's probably got a comms communications plan, a crisis plan in place. If you don't, that certainly will be one of the takeaways from this experience, and typically that's what has prompted those to be created, whether it was 2008, 9/11, whatever it might have been that prompted some school to do a crisis communications plan. I'm sure they're in place. But I want to pick up on what Rob said about we've survived the initial sort of piece, and so now it's thinking about what's next in terms of communicating and specifically out to alumni and donors. So what are some of the key messages that you're now building into messaging to go out to alumni and donors? And Katie, we'll start with you on this. Have you changed the narrative of all, or do you think you're going to change sort of going forward here as the school year comes to an end and we move into the summer months?
Yeah, that's a huge question, actually. And I want to start off by saying that thank God there's a crisis communication plan at the study. It's certainly, because this is an emerging situation, this is not stagnant by any means. And every day schools are receiving a variety of different types of, types of information upon which they have to sort of move quickly. Reaction is a big part of our days these days. And so that, combined with having to think ahead and think about what some of those messages are going to be, is a challenge. At the study, being a small organization, independent, as an independent school, we are obviously in the middle of multiple different levels of campaigns. We've just closed our major comprehensive campaign, and we haven't even really had a chance to celebrate that with our donors. We're embarking upon a building campaign, and how does that look? When is that going to look like? But I think what our immediate challenge is, it's not a challenge. What we're really doing is we're still reaching out to our donors. We're talking to our donors. We're having conversations with them. We're asking them for their insight. We're doing that good old, pick up the phone and call the people who support you. One of the things that we're overlaying a lot of these days in our communications to our donors and our supporters is is how the school was able to pivot really, really quickly from a facilities type learning environment to an online learning environment. And that's been the message that we have been sharing with our donors. And we've, indicated that this is the kind of thing, these are the kinds of opportunities that our donors, have supported and have allowed us to have basically enabled us to be able to pivot so quickly. That there is they have been involved, and that they are really critical in the school's ability to be able to move ahead with this type of online learning. So it's consistent communication with them.
That's great. I think I just know in provinces across the country, the public systems had a challenge with the switch from in-class to online for K-12. So the independent school sector across the country has certainly led that effort, without a doubt. Grant, one of the, I guess, questions that we were posed with was, how do you talk about ongoing priorities with alumni and donors? You don't want to sound tone deaf to the pandemic, but you also have to sort of keep those things on the table. Have you had to make some adjustments in your communications?
Yeah, well, we were in an interesting place actually, because we were sort of in the middle stages of a new strategic planning process. So we were actually starting to revamp some of those ongoing priorities, to take a look at them and to revisit them and to make sure that we still wanted those to be our priorities. So I think now we're going to have to kind of reboot that again and see how this pandemic response and the response that we've all had to make might inform how we change our priorities going forward. So yeah, obviously there's a bit of a pause in the early days where we focused on the critical move to online. But going forward, I think the priorities broadly, they're going to end up being the same. It's going to be supporting students. It's going to be supporting research. It's going to be supporting communities. And the way you frame that in the light of this pandemic response, that's what's really going to change. And so one of the things that we've done is we wanted to avoid being one of the many emails that you got, I'm sure everybody got it from every company you've ever purchased a pair of jeans online from. Oh, message from the CEO, we care about you and you're part of our family, right? We didn't want it to be that generic. So what we focused on is actionable ways for people to demonstrate their support directly for students, directly for people who are the most impacted by it. And so we had really good success with Student Emergency Fund fundraising, for example. I mean, that's just the direct cash that we give to students in need. Normally, we don't have too many of those, but this year we had a lot, and we had a robust fund, but it was quickly being depleted. So we put it on an appeal and got immediate and fantastic response from people. But on the other side, we know that there's a financial component to this pandemic too, right? And I'm sorry, I'm having the classic Zoom thing. My cat just jumped up on me, so a little visit from Shadow. There's a financial component to this pandemic response, and it's not affecting everybody equally. So we want to make sure that our donors who may not be in a position to give as much this year, or who may not be able to give as much as they normally do this year, also feel connected. And so we're talking about international students earlier, living in residence. We've got a small number that have nowhere else to go, that are probably getting pretty lonely and don't have as much food services as we can normally give them. So we recently put out a call to alumni and to donors to send messages of support. So whether they're able to kick in for the Student Emergency Fund or not, they can still be a part of that community. They can still support students. And what we're going to do is we're going to print off those messages and put them in care packages with baked goods and a little bit of Brandon University swag and maybe some games and entertainment things. You know, if you're trying to ride out this pandemic in your suburban home with a nice big yard, that's a really big, a different experience than if you're trying to ride it out in a dorm room, where maybe in some places you're not allowed to go to the park, right? So being aware that the priority is students, that's not changing, but how we support students is changing. And so providing people many different ways to show their support. I think that's been key for us recently.
Thanks, Grant. I think the messages from alumni is great. We heard in last week's webinar, which we were talking about the class of 2020 and what some of the alumni offices are doing for those students soon to become alumni. And one of the schools talked about actually having videos from, the 50th class as an example, doing a video for the new class saying, congratulations, you're graduating. Just can't do it in person. We're going to do it in a lot of different ways. So I think it's great to get alumni involved. Derek, you guys, mid-campaign, lots of fundraising activity going on, a new branding message out from the university, and then lots of change. And so I know you've kind of, as you said earlier, you turned the page on a new communications plan for alumni and donors, given the realities. How did you incorporate some of those campaign and or branding messages in that new comms plan?
Yeah, great timing, with this pandemic. We were literally 6 months after our launch and the new brand, and we've actually put the new Made by McGill brand aside for now. We made a very conscientious decision at the outset not to associate the new brand with our COVID-19 response. In terms of what we have been doing, so it's interesting. We're quite fortunate at McGill in that one of the real areas of strength for us and one of the campaign priorities happens to be infectious disease and global health. So we have a very large and renowned faculty of medicine, as I think most people know, and we are already doing a lot of work in infectious disease already. So for us, in some respects, it was very easy to speak about a campaign priority within the context of a COVID-19 response. So I would say that in the early days of the sort of pandemic, say the first 3-4 weeks, it wasn't a stretch to talk about the great work happening in McGill and really ground it in the COVID-19 story. What we're trying to do now, and I think people are appreciating the information and the insight that we're providing to them, and our objective really from the beginning has been to use this opportunity to remind our alumni and donors and even the greater community outside of our campuses here in Quebec and across Canada of the wonderful expertise at McGill, and really show that McGill could be one of the institutions that will lead the way in finding both scientific solutions as well as sort of dealing with some of the other tangential issues, be they psychological, social, economic. Now that we're sort of moving past that kind of the first 6 weeks, that shock where people were just in this period of not even comprehending what was happening to the world around them, we're starting to now sort of pick up the campaign priorities again and try to build again more connections between the two. So where it's easy to talk about an infectious disease response in this pandemic, another very, very big priority for us is sustainability and climate change, which has sort of been fallen off the tracks, or artificial intelligence has been another area. So now we're trying to figure out how could we remind people or ensure that these other components get built into it. So like, for example, some of the great work that people are doing in AI to help, advance advance the science to find a vaccine, or to help track patients and track the spread of the infection across the country. So in some cases, it's quite easy to do. And in other cases, it is a bit more difficult depending on what the theme is. But I think we're sort of entering from a communication standpoint, what I would call sort of the second phase, where we're really trying to think a bit longer term and really trying to bring expertise from across the university that's not just in our faculty of medicine, for instance, and really build that into the McGill narrative so people really understand all of the assets that we can bring to this fight. Just a final piece on the student piece, again, as Grant said, and obviously support for students has always been a huge piece of any fundraising we do at McGill. And our last campaign, the previous one, I believe it accounted for about 60% of our overall philanthropic support. And again, launching an emergency student relief fund very early in the pandemic, I think was very helpful for us to do. We were probably, like a lot of other institutions, a bit apprehensive. Are people in a position to want to give back? Can they do so financially? But we felt in conversation with our scholarship and student aid office that it was the right thing to do. And I have to tell you, we were overwhelmed by support. You know, the number of donors who stepped up, the sizes of the gifts. We had 3 major gifts that came in, but just, you know, people that felt maybe I can only give $20, $50, but the fact that I can step up and help someone who's, you know, in a more unfortunate situation than I am right now has been just very heartening to see that sort of level of generosity and how we're able to tie McGill into it. And so whether we're talking about support for students or support for research or the science, you know, really to try to remind people that McGill has got to be a central part of that story, because we will come out of this pandemic eventually, and we want our donors to remember the great work that we did and the role that they can play in helping us advance all of that.
Thanks, Derek. Rob, I think certainly in the Canadian landscape, the Student Emergency Fund work really rose to the, you know, you saw schools do it, maybe not so much in the private independent school space, Katie, well, certainly different there, but in the post-secondary space, just huge responses, as Derek and Grant have both said. Did you hear about those happening in other parts of the world, Rob? Have student emergency funds been sort of front and center in communicating out to alumni and donors?
Very much so. As it happens, right before this meeting, I was on a meeting with about, I don't know, 60 or so of the case laureates. And the laureates are senior volunteers and advisors, folks who've written books or, you know, chaired conferences or been on boards or whatever. And the topic was really, what are you doing? What's working? And one of the observations that came out was that people are being very successful, was essentially saying on the annual fund side, we need unrestricted gifts. You know, we need to be able to be responsive to whatever the needs are, as opposed to, like, historically you might say, well, I want it just to go to scholarship, or I want it to go to support this for the research. And when people have been very successful, was saying, look, we have all kinds of emergencies, whether they're it's for students, whether it's for faculty, whether it's for, you know, we have to bring in crews to clean things up. We just need unrestricted dollars. And those campaigns have been very successful, and because people, I think that comes to a point historically. I think that in situations like this, people tend to give to what their highest priority institutions are. You know, they might not have as much money to give. I think, as Derek said, they may be constrained in their resources, but they're going to focus their giving. They're going to focus their philanthropy on those issues or causes or institutions that are most important to them. And typically, you know, your alma mater is in the top 2 or 3 of those regards. So that's one thing that's really important, I think. And somebody on the call said, essentially the equivalent of always be asking, you know, don't stop, you know, just keep asking, because people want to be involved. They know that this is a pandemic that has having an impact on people all around the world, people who are involved in our institutions. So that was one of the recommendations that came up. Another recommendation that actually came up, a recommendation of observation, I think, was from David Palmer, who you probably know David. He's the VP for Advancement at University of Toronto. And he said, I wrote this down, the most valuable resource a wealthy person has is time. And one thing that's happened as a result of the pandemic is people who you've had a hard time getting in touch with before, because they were at their business, they were on an airplane going, you know, whatever, they're home. They're sitting by the phone, you know. So in fact, one person made an observation that they had a major donor. They got him, they'd been trying to get a hold of him for months. They got him on the phone, and the person wouldn't stop talking. You know, they just, and this wasn't David, this was somebody else. They just said, you know, that they just wanted to really unload. And as a result of that whole conversation, they made a five-figure commitment to that emergency fund. You know, but the people are anxious for that type of interaction, and being there and reaching out is well received. The final point I want to make is not from the laureates conversation, but is, I think, as you all know, a couple of years back, CASE purchased VSE, Voluntary Supportive Education, the survey, which is really about giving and giving trends and all that stuff. And VSE has shown over the years that principal and major and estate gifts track just virtually in the same line with New York Stock Exchange. And annual gifts track with household income. So we're going to see some falling off, you know, in the major gifts and household. But again, if you think about the fact that people are still, it doesn't stop entirely. When the 2008 recession or whatever else hits, it doesn't stop entirely. It'll slow down. It'll track with other financial indicators, other economic indicators, but people are still giving, they're just refocusing. So I think the key point that I would want to make is you need to keep asking, you need to keep reminding people of your relevance in terms of Derek talking about your public health issues, Grant or Katie talking about what your students need. I mean, those are things that are legitimate, and putting yourself out as a solution in a troublesome time is a really valid, I think, way to reach out.
That's helpful, Rob. I think the strong piece there is the message of being a solution, right? I think educational institutions carry that weight in our society, and even in these times, which are difficult, you need to keep reminding people of that. And to Derek's point about McGill's position in sort of the scientific and the sociological and economical, that's going to be a piece after this is all, sorry, I shouldn't say after it's all done, because it's not going to end for a long time, but there's going to be some, social reviews of COVID-19 and its impact on society and all those kind of things. And I think, again, education will play a big role in that, without a doubt. We had a couple of questions submitted with respect to virtual event initiatives and whether or not schools are sort of looking into those things. I know last week we talked a lot about graduation ceremonies with the panel and how those are being done. But, now we're into that time of fall activities or maybe even spring and summer activities that schools run, golf tournaments, graduations. And then we get into the alumni events, homecoming events, those kind of things. How are you all involved in that communication planning with respect to those initiatives? Derek, I'll start with you because I know McGill's got typically a pretty hefty schedule on the alumni side.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot in that question. I mean, so let me actually just backtrack a little bit. I would say that obviously we're not doing in-person events. Everything is now moved online, and we're sort of slowly building up sort of a calendar of activity. The webcast that I referenced in my introductory remarks was interesting, and maybe I'll just share that story quickly. So this goes back to February, before the sort of full weight of the pandemic was upon us. We were actually asked to sort of reach out to some of our infectious disease experts and maybe do some things, bring this expertise to our alumni. So there were a bunch of emails flying around, and before I even had a chance to weigh in, there was discussion about, let's hold an event, because I mean, we're a university, that's alumni offices, that's what we do, we hold events. And I mean, we saw that this was a fast breaking story, and my concern was, well, how long is it going to take us to organize an event? Probably, at least 3 or 4 weeks. We're going to have to go, rent a hotel and bring in food and beverages. And then I said, well, and then we're going to bring 1,000 people into a room to talk about a very contagious virus. That doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. So I had sort of proposed, why don't we just do this in the form of a webcast? And we hadn't really done a lot of webcasts. So we literally, so people said, great, let's do it. We can do it in 3 days. So 3 days later, we brought our 2 experts into our makeshift studio at McGill, and I did a quick interview with them. And we had, a couple of thousand people tune in. And I sort of was wondering after, how many events would we have to do of 50, 100 people to get 2,000 people or 2,000 eyeballs on something? So it was actually a bit of an early lesson for us. So a lot of the events that we're doing now, whether they're the weekly webcasts that my communications team puts together or some of the alumni events that we're doing. I mean, we have events where, our webcasts will bring in anywhere from, 1,000 to 1,500 people live, and then of course they're all recorded and we get thousands more watching. We've had events with 500 capacity on Zoom and other platforms such as this that sell out very quickly. So I think it's an incredible way to engage our alumni and donor communities in a way that in many ways is much easier. It's much more cost efficient. We don't have to feed these people. We don't have to serve them alcoholic beverages. We don't have to rent expensive ballrooms in hotels. For our alumni who live all over the world, we don't have to fly 2 or 3 experts and, you know, a VP and 6 fundraisers out to Hong Kong or to London or San Francisco anymore. We can basically just invite them all to their screens. Now, you could argue that it's obviously not as rich an experience from a kind of social networking perspective. Given the times that we're in, obviously we have no choice. But I think that when we emerge from this, and even after we move back to a time when physical and social distancing is permitted again, I really think that this notion of virtual events is going to continue and be a much larger plank of what we do in alumni and donor offices in our profession.
I don't think there's any doubt in that, Derek.
Even at CCAE.
Yeah, even at CCAE, for sure. Katie, the independent school year is not over yet. Still sort of goes into the early stages of June. What are you planning in terms of virtual celebrations, graduations, etc.? Both so now with students, but then also engaging alumni in that.
Yes, it is. Oh, it is. It's a tough one, Mark. It's we have obviously, just like everybody else, we've put everything, you know, either postponed or canceled or made decisions that, you know, specific decisions to do something online. You know, our closing ceremony is something that is a rite of passage for our, you know, graduating class, and that is something that I think, you know, something that the school is endeavoring to do virtually. Certainly, you know, things like our athletics banquet and so forth. We're going to try and go virtual. And this is, I think, this is important for our students. It's also important for our staff, our faculty and staff. Something that we actually haven't talked a lot about is morale amongst our students and amongst our staff. And I think that so much in this world has changed in education and you know, very recently, that I think if the school can give or can offer, you know, little nuggets of some familiarity. Yes, we're doing that online. Yes, we're doing that with our teachers. Yes, we're doing, you know, online classes and so forth. But a really big, important part of education at the study is the experience. And it runs deep with certain traditions that the school has every year. And so the school is actively right now trying to figure out ways to sort of capture that tradition in a virtual way. It's certainly not easy. You know, I've been on a number of different calls recently and Zoom meetings with my colleagues to try and figure out, you know, we have a donor reception coming up. We want to do it virtually. How are we going to do it virtually to keep it to keep that connectivity? How are we going to do it so that it doesn't feel like a Zoom meeting? But I think that keeping those little nuggets alive in a moment like this is really important. It'll keep the morale up, and it'll certainly keep us all connected. Insofar as the fall, we're not there yet. We're talking about it. We're actually talking about blending a part of our graduation ceremony, which would have normally taken place with our closing in June. We're talking about blending that with our homecoming that typically happens in the fall. So all of this is to say that, you know, it's forcing all of us to be creative, stay creative, get really creative, and embrace, you know, the virtual world, so that we can give our students a sense of normalcy.
Thanks, Katie. Rob, in the States, some of your member schools or around the globe sort of moving to this virtual event delivery. How are they communicating that out? Are they finding people receptive to that kind of change?
I think it depends on the audience.
Yeah.
One of the comments that was made in this earlier discussion, I was in the laureates discussion, was it kind of reinforces what Derek was saying, that from an alumni relations perspective, they can actually get a lot more people involved on online events than they could in in-person events. And a couple of the alumni relations, you know, the major folks on any given campus in alumni relations saying, we're really going to reconsider, pandemic or no pandemic, how do we maybe keep alumni more engaged by a better use of our online capacities than we have formerly done. I think it's a little bit different from what Katie's talking about, because I think for a student, and I have, my son's in college, good friend of mine, his daughter was just graduating at University of California, Berkeley. And for them, not having the pomp and circumstance, the actual ceremony, the hugs and kisses, the tears, I don't know if this is true at McGill, but my daughter went to McAllister, and when they have the graduation, they have the bagpipers coming through. You're not going to get that online. Now, maybe you can get a bagpipe line going through your online thing, but it's not the same as having your eardrums attacked by 20 bagpipers, in kilts walking down. It's just not the same. So I honestly don't know what we're going to be able to do to make up to those students whose graduation and the consummate experience of their K-12 or it's their tertiary education, they're not going to have that wonderful moment, and it's just not going to be there, and I honestly don't know. I think the jury is out, in terms of what we might be able to do for them. People say, well, we'll do it in the fall instead. We'll have you come in with our December class. It's like, yeah, but I've moved on by then. So I'm not sure how we'll be able to recover that emotional, and honestly, how much that emotional moment ties into their long-term feelings for alma mater. But again, going back to the alumni relations side, I think it opens up a new possibility of being much more engaging. You can do things on an asynchronous process. It doesn't require somebody to get on a plane and fly to Quebec, to participate in something. They can get that taste, and they have the physical memory themselves of having been there and knowing the place. So it's not an introduction. I honestly think from a marketing point of view, the more interesting and challenging moment right now in the US, we're 2 days away from May 1st, which is typically the date in which people confirm what institution they're going to go to. And usually that would be a season in which campus visits and college fairs and all kinds of in-person activities, well, those are off the board now. And so I think there's a great deal of uncertainty about what the fall class is going to, A, are we going to be able to have a regular semester come fall, and B, what's going to look like? Are we going to be able to rely on getting the same students or getting the same percentage of students we historically have? I think that's very much up in the air right now. So
I think, a couple of comments. I didn't go to my fall graduation when I did my master's degree, because as you said, I'd already moved on. And I've got a daughter who's graduating this spring. We were going to head off to her institution for her big ceremony in early June, and of course that's not happening. So what is her experience going to be like? I'm not sure she's listening, but we're actually going to do a little ceremony ourselves here. We're going to get a gown, and we're going to walk her down the middle of our court and have all the neighbors come out and cheer and do that kind of thing, just for a little fun. Grant, at Brandon, this notion of the fall and what it means in terms of communications, and both out to alumni and donors, as school is kind of up in the air, sort of moves through spring and summer sessions, but also now I think schools are starting to think about the fall. What is any ideas of what's going to happen or take place at Brandon?
Well, yeah, tons of ideas, and they're all contradictory, right? Like nobody really knows exactly what it's going to look like. Currently here in Manitoba, things are looking pretty optimistic, actually. The Premier just this morning released sort of a reopening plan that, at least presumes that we're going to be able to have larger gatherings, and that would include classes, etc., as early as September. But certainly there's lots of planning being going on for what that could look like, even on the optimistic side of things, but also on the not so optimistic side of things. And I think it's a wait and see for what that looks like right now. Of course, you can't wait and see for some things. So homecoming, like at the study, it's a fall event for Brandon University as well, and it's one of our highest touch events for a lot of alumni, and a lot of alumni are also donors, and we should be getting registrations right now, and we're just not able to guarantee that we can have a traditional fall homecoming the way that we normally do. And that may be, we can't have gatherings of that size. It may be people can't travel here, or maybe that they don't want to travel here and self-isolate for 14 days before they come to a 3-day homecoming, right? So for us, it is similar to other places. It's an opportunity to explore what it looks like if we do alternate types of events. And we're all doing online Zoom things like this, Zoom meetings, FaceTime meetings. I think there's a little bit of Zoom fatigue in some circles, right? Like people don't always want to do that. But I think the option is there to take advantage of the technology, and the advantage that we're experiencing right now is if you have a traditional in-person event, you all have to be in the same place at the same time. Now with a Zoom meeting, you all have to be there at the same time, but you can be spread out geographically. And you can take that one step further, like I assume you do with webcasts, and it's, you don't have to be at the same place, and you don't have to watch it at the same time. And the challenge there is that then you're starting to compete with entities like Netflix or HBO or Disney Plus, right? Like people have a lot of options for what they're going to watch on their screen. What makes your event or webcast or recording that compelling? And so we're not doing a ton of that right now, but we certainly are exploring it for some of the really big events like our convocation, which of course, like everybody else, can't have a spring convocation. We don't know exactly what we're going to do in the fall, whether we'll be permitted to have something then, whether students, as you say, will be interested in that, whether we'll give them the opportunity instead to come to a future spring convocation. What we're seeing though, is we're seeing a lot of students who value that moment, who are really looking forward to that emotional moment, and aren't really interested in a virtual version of that. They don't want an ersatz convocation. They don't want the short end of the stick. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with brand new things that we've never done for convocation, that would be unique to this year, that we can give students something to mark that moment of graduation. And hopefully that they'll still be interested in having that moment, and will come when we do a complete full convocation in the future, whether that's in the fall or in spring 2021, that we can offer them that moment that they clearly really want and clearly really value. But we can give them something else right now, and to make sure that it is not a lesser version of convocation, but something new and something different. And so we're doing a lot of brainstorming what that might look like right now, and putting final pieces on that. But it's probably going to include a pre-recorded video that probably looks a little bit like a Zoom meeting, and it speaks to what we're all going through right now, but celebrates each of our grads and delivers messages of support. Similar approach might have to be taken for homecoming. We don't know what we're going to do there yet, but we're certainly letting our alumni know that, and shouldn't be news to them. It's not news to them, but that plans are up in the air. And what we're seeing though is that alumni are also taking it upon themselves to start exploring other opportunities. So we're seeing some alumni, for example, who weren't really interested in joining our Facebook groups, starting to self-organize on Facebook and saying, well, okay, if we can't do our class reunion the way we anticipated at homecoming, we can at least connect on Facebook in a way that they weren't really interested in before. And if we can come, well, we still have this. It's like an appetizer course for the main meal. And if homecoming can't happen, then it is something we wouldn't have had anyways. So I think there's definitely an appetite for experimentation, and everybody knows that it can't be what you did last year. You're going to try new things, and technology is going to be a part of that. But they don't want it to be the only thing that we do. So I think we're going to keep it in our minds that returning to in person, and especially for large events, still a goal that we have and still a desire that a lot of people have. But that we could add to those events in ways that we didn't have the traction to do before by adding virtual things.
Thanks, Grant. Kind of a last throw-out question. Any new technologies in the communication space that you sort of see helping you with sending messages, being connected with alumni and donors? I think, we're all using the same channels currently. Anything else on the horizon from your perspective as experts that you might see your schools adopting, or Rob, that you're hearing of other schools that may be thinking of adopting?
From our perspective, it's not so much new as much as it is rethinking. The classic example would be right now we're publishing the May-June issue of Currents, the Case magazine. We made the decision to not do a print publication this time because it was going to be mailed to all kinds of offices that are empty. So we're going to be spending all the money to print it and ship it and everything else, and it's going to sit in boxes on the floor, being irrelevant. And we managed to convert some of the advertising dollars to support the online publication. So we're building a more robust online version of the magazine than we would typically do. So I think at least in our point of view, it's a matter of repurposing. I'm not necessarily seeing new technologies other than various versions of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all that sort of stuff. It seems to be where the real battle place is going on, is who's connecting technology are you going to use, but I haven't seen really brand new stuff emerge, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I read this week Facebook is going to try and challenge Zoom in terms of a platform. Derek, anything new technology-wise your team might sort of dive into for connecting with alumni and donors?
Before I answer that, I just want to follow up on one thing Rob said earlier. I was trying to look for some sign of something uplifting that's coming out of this pandemic, and I did find one, thanks to Rob, which is that we have finally managed to silence the McGill bagpipes, which is a good thing. In terms of technology, though, I think my answer would be the same as Rob. I think it's using existing technologies at our disposal, whether it be Zoom. Again, with our alumni magazine, we were supposed to publish one this summer. We've now pushed that back to the fall, and it will be completely online. So again, we're looking now at how do we enhance our existing websites so that the presentation won't be as clunky. Even our alumni website, we're with iModules. We did some hard coding work with them a couple of weeks ago, again, to find a way to present the information in a more user-friendly way, because we weren't necessarily doing it as such before. So I think it's forced us to look at the existing technologies right now and see how much more we can get out of it, how much better use we can get of it. Microsoft Teams has been an absolute lifesaver for us at McGill in terms of connecting teams internally. Zoom, likewise, obviously, for a lot of our external facing events. So it's really just, let's make sure we're using the technologies to the best of our abilities and pushing the boundaries a little bit more in terms of how we use them so we get the best bang for our buck with them.
Katie, any?
Yeah, I would echo what Rob and Derek have said, but I'll give you an example of the study. We recently launched our new website, and we have this fantastic portal. And the portals are, sort of siphoned off for parents and for old girls and for faculty and staff and so forth. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to have a very designated platform with a very, message specific to a very specific constituency, and let those messages live in these areas that are, that are protected. It's a way to remind our community that as a community, we are a community, but when it comes down to it, there are certain messages that are a lot more relevant to our alum or to our parents or to whomever else. And so just being able to leverage those portals has been really helpful for us.
That's good advice for sure. And Grant, last to you on the new technology piece, and then I'll wrap up.
Sure. Well, if I could just say one thing quickly too, picking up on bagpipes, this would have been the first year at Convocation where our new president was going to pipe in all the graduates. So we dodged that bullet perhaps, but he has instead been piping every Friday at 7 p.m. in his driveway to support frontline workers. He says, like, he has a good line, bagpipes are a naturally self-isolating instrument. So very, very safe, but we're still getting some good publicity, I suppose, from that. With regards to technology, similar to what other people have said, we're not seeing new things, but rather a willingness to embrace things that existed and make use of them maybe in better ways. What's interesting, whether it's Zoom or Teams or the portals that Katie mentioned, is I think we're moving towards small group chats, right? Like it's not a broadcast the way that social media maybe 5 or 6 years ago would have been seen, where you're putting out the same message to everybody, but you're bringing smaller groups together and you're having conversations with them, and you're really tailoring your message in that way. And taking that even one step further, one of the things we've seen during this pandemic is a return to traditional phone calls, one-on-one, and you can't do it in person, but you can still do it with, I think it's an app on most people's smartphones, you can still call. So not the newest technology, but I think in these times where people are sitting at home a lot, they're craving a little bit more human interaction. And scrolling through Twitter or Facebook is not the same as 5 or 6 people in a small group chat, and it's not the same as one-on-one conversations, no matter how you get that.
Very true on the telephone piece. I think, well, for those that are back connecting one-on-one, I think the phone has become a far greater tool than it probably was a few months ago. We've just sort of tipped over the top of the hour. Our goal is to always keep these to 1 hour. So I certainly want to thank Katie, Grant, Rob, and Derek for their time today, your insights into this space of the changing narrative, specifically how things have changed communicating out to alumni and donors. I think we had a bit of a piece in the middle where we talked about students and certainly the graduation ceremonies, and that I know is on everybody's mind across the country. This time of year, graduation touches every department at every school, and so at least it should, and because it is the most important day of a calendar at an academic institution, and so everybody's involved and everybody is trying to build the best plan for how they celebrate those traditions and those recent and soon-to-be new grads. CCAE will send a link, the recording link, out to everybody in the next week. There'll be a request for some evaluation and feedback, and we certainly like to hear from folks. Next week, we actually have 2 of these webinars. Wednesday, the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about virtual alumni relations and how that office is shifting its thinking in terms of fall. And so we talked a little bit about homecoming and some of the other events. We're going to hear from some alumni relations leaders from across the country on that on Wednesday. And then Thursday, we're quite excited. Our keynote speaker from our national conference in Winnipeg, which, as Rob talked about CASE, we also canceled our big event in May in Winnipeg. But Sylvie D'Augusto was our keynote speaker scheduled to be in Winnipeg, and so she's going to do a 1-hour webinar for us, talking about working remotely, leading remotely, all those kind of things that everybody's experiencing in the last 6 weeks. So 2 events next week. All that information is on our website. Again, huge thanks to our panel. Thanks to all the attendees that signed in, and we'll look forward to chatting again in the future. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.